evening. In this age of tweeted selfies, twerking, and Miley Cyrus, Charles Krauthammer is that rare and essential thing. A public intellectual. He is, by most estimates, the nation's leading conservative commentator, distinguished by his insight, his wit, and his clarity of mind. An alumnus of McGill, Balliol, and Harvard, trained as a doctor, along the way he reinvented himself as a writer. He has described his life story as improbable and characterized by serendipity and sheer blind luck. He is the originator of the phrase the Reagan Doctrine, and he has been a keen observer of, and indeed a profound influence on American foreign policy for over 3 decades. He is distinguished by being, in his own words, the only entity on Earth other than rogue states that has received an apology from the White House. And he is a fierce opponent of the errant comma. His most recent book, Things That Matter, 3 Decades of Passions, Pastimes, and Politics, is a collection of his columns. It is a wide-ranging demonstration of the breadth of his interests and the fluency of his thinking, all built on the fundamental premise that politics is just a means to an end, that it exists only to make possible the things that matter: friendship, love, art, philosophy, history, baseball, science, chess, nature. Politics, for all of its finality, is the essential platform for these real things. And if politics goes wrong, all these things, the things that matter, are destroyed. In reading Dr. Krauthammer's book, you will learn, if you hadn't already known it, that he is a man of deep feeling. The ringing simplicity of his eulogies to his brother, his mentor, his friend, the subtlety of his humor, and his relish for the ridiculous make his writings both companionable and engrossing. And if the underlying compassion of his essays is not evidence enough of his character, Dr. Krauthammer is a dog lover. At the passing of his son's black lab, Chester, he wrote, "Some will protest that in a world with so much human suffering, it is something between eccentric and obscene to mourn a dog. I think not. After all, it is perfectly normal, indeed deeply human, to be moved when nature presents us with a vision of great beauty. Should we not be moved when it produces a vision, a creature of the purest sweetness? And should we not be privileged to encounter a man of such depth and fundamental humanity?" Please join me in welcoming Dr. Charles Krauthammer.
I'll just click while I'm ahead. Thank you for that lovely introduction. There are nice introductions and there are kind introductions. Nice introductions are the ones where they list all your achievements, they get it transcribed and notarized, and they send your mother a copy. Kind introductions, like that lovely introduction you just heard. In fact, when I heard that quotation from the eulogy to my dog, I thought, this is dangerous. I might lose my reputation as a mean son of a bitch. We are off the record, aren't we? But a kind introduction is one where they leave stuff out, and that was exceptionally kind. For example, she kindly left out the fact that I was once a speechwriter for Walter Mondale. And people ask me, of course, how do you go from Walter Mondale to Fox News? And I tell them the answer is rather simple. I was young once.
Yeah.
The other part that was very kindly left out was the fact that I was once a psychiatrist. Technically speaking, actually, I still am a psychiatrist. But truth be told, I'm a psychiatrist in remission. Doing very well, thank you. Haven't had a relapse in 25 years. I'm sometimes asked to compare what I do today as a political analyst in Washington with what I used to do as a psychiatrist in Boston. And I don't get ahead of me now. That's my line. And I tell them, as you just heard, it's really not that different. In both lines of work, I deal every day with people who suffer from paranoia and delusions of grandeur. The only difference is that the paranoids in Washington have access to nuclear weapons. Makes the stakes a little higher, the work a little more interesting. I'm really delighted to be here tonight, delighted to be in Milwaukee, delighted to be at this fantastic, lovely institution. But the truth is that I'm happy to be anywhere where Juan Williams can't interrupt me. I'll be sure to tell him how you feel. Stay away from Milwaukee. I'm here to talk to you about a book I've just written, Things That Matter. I got a call about end of December from a reporter from Newsweek. I didn't even know Newsweek still existed. Apparently it does, at least online. And she said, I'm doing an article, and my editors asked me to do an article about your book. It's been extremely successful, and we're trying to figure out why. A promising opening for an interview. So, of course, I decided that I would play this one very humble, self-deprecating, and I said, I'm very gratified and flattered, but I really don't know. You really have to call other people in when you don't let me know. Give me a call. 2 weeks later, I get an email from a friend who says, did you see the Newsweek article about your book? And I open up the attachment, and the headline is, Krauthammer's book flying off the bookshelves. No one knows why. So to hell with humility, I'm going to tell you why. It's several books in one. I mean, the main reason I wrote it, I got a call from the publisher, and they said, I've been asked to write books for a long time, and I resisted because I am exceedingly lazy. And they said, would you like to do a collection? So I figured, well, I can do that in a week. So I said yes, of course it took me 9 months. The worst part about it was I had to read everything I'd ever written. And when I got to about the 2 millionth word, I was suicidal. If I had to read one more word in my own writing, that was it. I was going out a window. So luckily, I reached the end, and I was able to pick the stuff that I liked the most. And in some ways, it's a survey. It's kind of a historical survey of life in America and abroad since the 1980s. I began my career as a journalist on the day Ronald Reagan was sworn in 1981. It was a hell of a coincidence. And the book covers the 80s and 90s, of course, last decade. And it falls into place. It's interesting that history sometimes can divide itself by decade. You know, the 60s, for example. You know what they say about the 60s. If you remember the 60s, you weren't there. Those of you from Colorado and Washington State, I have no recollection of the 60s. You know, the 80s was a very interesting time, the Reagan Revolution, the last days of the Cold War, which of course I've returned last week. The 1990s were actually the most interesting. And I write about this in the book. They were the most interesting because nothing happened. The 1990s were really our holiday from history. And I remember, there's a column in the book, there's not a chapter in the book, precisely on that. I always had this feeling during the 90s, because remember, the Cold War, the age of the great existential struggles, fascism, Nazism, communism, starts in the 30s. They essentially end the day after Christmas 1991 when the Soviet Union dissolves, literally dissolves. Now, those of you of my age who are no longer young will remember growing up and into adulthood being absolutely sure, as I was, that I would never live to see the end of the Cold War, that it was a kind of a fact of life. And the Soviet Union was this great monolith with its satellites and its allies. And we would be in this state of great existential struggle. That's what it was. It was life and death. Forever. And then miraculously, without a shot being fired, the Soviet Union simply disappears. This was an event of biblical importance. And I remember at the time writing, in fact, to my mentor, the one you mentioned, the one I wrote the obituary about, a wonderful professor who fled Nazi Germany and ended up at Harvard Medical School, that it was an event so unexpected, so unusual in history, that it was hard to believe that one had the privilege to live through that. And what struck me right afterwards was that we were living in an age, which is the 90s, that was utterly unusual. We got used to it. I mean, this was a decade of peace, prosperity. In fact, the tranquility was so profound that the major issue of the late 1990s was a presidential zipper problem. And but if that's what was the stuff of our headlines, that meant that the really serious, existential, deadly, frightening stuff that history can produce was not around. There's a chapter in the book that talks about a little talk I gave to my son's high school. This was in 1997. And I wrote about the fact that I told these young people that they were living through something very unusual. They were living through an era of profound tranquility and peace and safety and prosperity that was very unusual in history. And I was trying to tell them how utterly anomalous this time was. Now, the part I left out of that talk, but that I included in the article that I wrote that week for my column, was that this could not last. I didn't want to depress them. That would have been child abuse to tell them that. For the adults in my column audience, it just seemed to me, I was totally struck by the fact that this cannot last. This kind of thing is so historically unusual. Golden ages never last. And they always end. And I wrote a column that ended with, the only question remaining was not whether this would end, but when and how. Would it end in fire or would it end in ice? We know it ended in fire, and that was 9/11. That was almost a full decade. Christmas 1991, September 2000. And I had this awful feeling on 9/11, that history with a capital H, this kind of history of struggle and angst and true tragedy that we had somehow skipped over and through in the 90s, had returned. And I actually wrote a column on the day of 9/11, which appeared the morning after. And it began, "This is not crime, this is war." I had the feeling that this kind of war, remember we'd been through war in one form or another from the early 30s right through to the end of the Cold War, that this had now returned. That the young people in my son's class would now unfortunately be exposed to what is real history, the history that almost always prevails. So the book, by being a collection of these essays covering these decades, in some way, I think offers that kind of history. It's episodic, it's idiosyncratic, it's a personal one, but I think it does give that kind of historical overview. And in that sense, it's a kind of a chronicle. And the end of the chronicle, of course, is the last half-decade, which is the age of Obama. And there, what's less interesting, or at least was to me at the time, was America on the world stage. It was much more the vision that Obama brought to the United States as president, the vision he brought to our politics in Washington. And to me, this was a very unusual man with a very unusual political philosophy. The case I tried to make, and it's in the book sprinkled throughout, beginning with the 2009 swearing in, and particularly his first State of the Union address. Now, you don't remember that State of the Union address, the 24th of February in 2009. You don't remember it because you have real lives. You do things, you make things, you have families, you create. I, for my sins, have to listen to this man all day. And my sins clearly are many. I remember the speech, and I was so struck by it at the time that I did something that I rarely do in my writing. I wrote it 5 weeks in a row, a column about that same speech, because I was so impressed by how historically unusual it is. And that is one of the other themes in the book. That is this kind of great national debate that Obama initiated with that speech, with his presidency, and with the way he went about carrying it out. The case I tried to make, and the case that you'll find in the book, is that Barack Obama is not a conventional American liberal. Now, you know what a liberal is. A liberal is somebody who doesn't care what you do as long as it's mandatory. He's not a Clinton. He's not a traditional man of the center left, which is what our politics generally produces. To me, again, coming off that speech and watching Obama since, he's much more of what I would call a social democrat. Not a socialist. I don't like to use that word because it encompasses very nasty kinds of socialism, totalitarian socialism. We're not talking about Soviet Union, North Korea, Cuba. We're talking about social democracy as practiced in Western Europe, which is a decent place, but it's a different kind of politics and vision of society than we traditionally have even on the liberal side of the aisle in the United States. People ask me, what's a social democrat? Well, the best way, I think, to explain it is with a story told once about Winston Churchill. Now, you remember that Churchill lost the election at the end of the Second World War. He becomes leader of the opposition, the prime minister. The winner is Clement Attlee, the leader of the Labour Party. One day, Churchill goes down to the men's room in the House of Commons, You know this one. I love this one. And there, standing alone at one of the urinals, is Clement Attlee. Place is empty otherwise. Now Churchill goes to the far end of the bench, 15 stalls over. Don't worry, that's as weird as it gets. And Attlee's a bit puzzled, and he looks over and says, feeling a bit standoffish today, are we, Winston? And Churchill said, not at all, my dear Clement. It's just that every time you see something large, you want to nationalize it. You know, I'm not even sure that story isn't a popular, but I don't care. As we say in the column writing business, that's a story just too good to check. Churchill also once said of Attlee that he was a sheep in sheep's clothing. That's neither here nor there. But I digress. I was impressed by the fact that Obama's a man, when he sees large statements, he wants to nationalize them. And in that speech, the one that is stuck in my mind, and that you don't remember because you haven't realized, he talked about three things. He wanted to change America in three ways. And he was specific: healthcare, education, and energy. Think about that. Healthcare is 1/6 of the economy. Education is the future. Energy, you control the pricing and production of energy. And you've controlled the sinews of an industrial democracy. You control, you semi-nationalize, you overregulate all three of those. And you seize what Lenin would call the commanding heights of a society. That's extremely ambitious. And I commend Obama. I do believe that it is in credit to him that he's been as honest, open, and courageous as he is to present that kind of agenda in a country that traditionally is center-right and that traditionally does not take kindly to European-style social democracy. And, for example, in the social democratic system, you put equality over liberty, you put protection, regulation, taxation, cradle to grave government intervention over, in the American system, you have, on the other hand, individualism, more risk, less regulation, more enterprise, and more inequality as a result. I mean, there's a reason in New York Harbor that we have a Statue of Liberty and not a Statue of Equality. We're different. The values that we have are rather different from Europe. So in a sense, I saw Obama as a different kind of American liberal. And in the book, there are several articles trying to deal with that, including one on the famous statement Obama made where he said, if you got a business, you didn't build that, somebody else made that happen. Remember that famous statement? So I think one of the other, again, I'm trying to explain in that Newsweek person why people have bought the book, it also contains this kind of running, traditional, classic argument, which is in 1789, between left and right, over essentially the size, the scope, the reach of government, or to put it another way, the nature of the American social contract, or to put it another way, sort of the nature of the relationship between citizen and state. It's a debate that Obama initiated by the boldness of the vision he has for America, and that has sort of seized our politics over the last 5 years. I would argue that just about every issue we've had at the center of our national debate, from the stimulus to the Affordable Care Act, to cap and trade, which was his attempt to control energy, to all the great debates we've had in the country are related to this central issue which I think is at the heart of our democracy, which is the relationship between citizen and state. So that to me is sort of the second aspect of the book, and perhaps that's one of the reasons it's had such appeal. The third part of the book actually is the one that I enjoy the most, and that is the part that is idiosyncratic. It's just stuff that I like, and it got a bit of range. I mean, the first half of the book is non-political. In fact, I had intended for the whole book to be non-political, and I write about that in the introduction. The book was going to be called "There's More to Life Than Politics." But in the end, and I'll try to explain this as I conclude my talk, incidentally, we're going to have a Q&A afterwards. But in the end, I realized that there was no way that I could possibly have a book that would represent my writings over these 30 years that would leave out the politics. So in part, it's the funky stuff, and in part, it's the politics. But I did really enjoy the other stuff. And that is because those to me are the things that matter. And there's everything in the book from Woody Allen to Winston Churchill, from Halley's Comet to the Hayden Planetarium. It is true that I do compare the virtues of dogs and cats, and it's a really easy call. Though I have to confess that as much as I am enamored of the sweetness of dogs, I have tremendous respect for the cunning of cats. After all, they have managed to get humans to feed them without ever giving up their superciliousness. A bit like the French. There's one column that begins something like, somebody's got to do it, nobody's going to do it, so I'll do it, Your Honor. I rise in defense of drunken astronauts. You remember there was a story that NASA had discovered that two of their astronauts had been a little bit tipsy upon takeoff. And I thought, since nobody thought that was a terrific thing, I was going to defend it. That's the kind of stuff you'll find. There is one column which I particularly enjoyed on a guy who overnight became a national American hero when he got arrested at the TSA at an airport for screaming, "Don't touch my junk." And as I write in that column on that, it doesn't quite have the cadence of "Don't tread on me." But in the age of Twitter, it will do. Although I must confess that my favorite column in the whole book is the one that is in defense of the F word. Now, when I suggested to my editors that that be the first chapter in the book, they wanted to have me committed. But you remember Dick Cheney actually did deploy the word on the floor of the Senate when Senator Leahy accused him of having enriched himself through Halliburton in the Iraq War, and the good vice president took exception and used the F word. And of course, Washington got so sanctimonious in this breach of civility on the floor of the Senate. I mean, I wrote it in the audience. Spent trying to speak about the virtues of the two possible forms of the uses of the F. The two-worder that ends with you, and the three-worder that starts with go. I would elaborate, but buy the book. So, this is the part of the book that I really enjoyed. I mean, it wasn't only that sort of crazy stuff. I mean, I like to write about chess, baseball. There are chapters called Heaven and Earth, Citizen and State. Body and Soul, there's a lot of medical ethics in there. I spent a lot of time working on that, sort of a relic of my days as a physician and of my days on the President's Council on Bioethics. So, I mean, it's a smorgasbord, I think. I ended up in the compact disc version. I ended up reading part of the book, but when I got past all the funky stuff, I think I've had quite enough of my own writing. So the second half is left to a professional reader. But I really enjoy writing it. I hope that you will enjoy reading it. And I must say that when I think about the fact that it has done well, I think the best reason of all probably is quite this. People would like to read a book about politics that is not name-calling. I mean, I really don't believe in that. And those of you who've read my stuff will know that if you want to make an argument, it should be done civilly. And the way to win an argument, or the way to reach people, which is even more important than winning, is to have respect for their assumptions. I have great respect for American liberalism. I think its achievements are many, and that the country is well served by having had an FDR who gave us Social Security, and having had an LBJ who gave us Medicare. The argument I have with liberalism is that it is now stuck in a kind of reactionary phase where it lives off these great successes and is unwilling, unable to even imagine changing them, altering them, reforming them, improving them, and clearly they have to be or they will perish. I'll give you one example. Social Security was instituted in 1935. Life expectancy at the time was 62. Today, life expectancy is 80. Social Security was intended by FDR to prevent older people from living in destitution. That is a noble goal. But now that we have had this enormous increase in longevity, we should realize that it was never intended to subsidize the green fees of baby boomers for a third of their adult lives. That's not what it was intended to do. And if you try to make it do that, you will go broke. And that to me is sort of the essence. Medicare, for example, was instituted before the age of modern high-tech medicine. You combine that with the effects of longevity, and you have a program that is totally out of control and that will not survive 5 more years. Everyone knows that. And to me, the burden and the agenda, in some ways, the mission of American conservatism is to take the best of these ideas, like Medicare, and to try to find ways to reform them and adapt them to the new age. My favorite example of how this thing works is Bismarck. He was the one who invented Social Security. And he pegged the age at which you first receive your pensions from the government. This was 1889. At the age of 70. You know what life expectancy was? 47. The man wasn't a philanthropist. He was a genius. Got all the credit, didn't have to spend a penny. So, I mean, that's the kind of argument I make in the book. And I try to begin with the fact that each side should respect the other in the great debate that we're having, the one about the size, scope, and reach of government. And in some way, and this is where I want to end because I told you that I intended not to write about politics, but in the end there was no way to avoid it. Because in the end, for all its grasping, grubby, cynical manipulativeness, that's the day-to-day practice of politics. It is in the end the most important and most sovereign of all endeavors. Because, and this you heard in that lovely introduction, all the lovely, beautiful, elegant things in life art and science and poetry and music, all of that hinges and depends on a society getting its politics right. And you can have the most efflorescent, flourishing society, the most developed culture in the world. You get your politics wrong, and everything dissolves. Think of Germany, 1933. You don't have to go back in history. Look at this unbelievably precise, almost controlled chemical experiment. Korea. In the South, they got the politics right. Prosperous, free society where the individual can flourish. North Korea, where they got the politics wrong. They live in a country totally enslaved, living in material and spiritual destitution. Same people, same history, same language, same culture. Only difference, one got the politics right, one got the politics wrong. And to me, that's why in the end I had to include the stuff about politics, because it is so. Even though we'd like to walk away from it, and there are many times that I want to walk away from it, except for that day when Cheney deployed the F word. It's the best day the Senate had all year. You want to walk away from it because it's a dirty, let's say it's, I wouldn't say dirty, it's hard to have clean hands, but in the end, it is sovereign, and in the end, it is the most important. And that, in the end, makes it the most noble. And I quote from John Adams in the introduction to the book. John Adams wrote that his generation had to work on war and politics so that the next generation could then develop itself in naval architecture and commerce, so that the third generation could devote itself to art and music, poetry, and porcelain of all things. And that kind of hierarchy was something that Adams understood, and something that sort of the American political system, American society understands. You've got to get the politics right, and we did. The miracle of America is that we got the politics right on day one. It is we talk about the biblical nature of the fall of the Soviet Union and how privileged we were, those of us old enough to live through that. Imagine how improbable, how providential it was that this small outpost of civilization across the ocean from Europe, this sort of semi-settled land, still semi-wilderness, should develop the greatest generation of political geniuses that man has ever seen, and would produce a constitution invented out of thin air, creating institutions and structures that had never even been imagined, that has endured longer than any other republic in the history of mankind. And we are the heirs of that. We have the unbelievable luck, the blessed luck of being heirs to that born in this land. And to me, that's what gives everyone the obligation never to walk away from that politics, no matter how soiled it feels, and no matter how unclean one feels sometimes. You can't walk away from it, because the Adams and the Jeffersons and the Washingtons managed to establish the structure, and it's the job of our generation and the next to tend it, because it will not tend itself. And that to me is the purpose of our politics, and that to me is the essence of our civilization. Bismarck also once said, he's my favorite pundit, he once said, and this is actually a quote, this one I did check, God looks after children, drunkards, idiots, and the United States of America. That's what God is saying to us. Thank you very much. virtues of the two possible forms of the uses of the other. The two-worder that ends with you, and the three-worder that starts with go. I would elaborate, but buy the book. So, this is the part of the book that I really enjoyed. I mean, it wasn't only that sort of crazy stuff. I mean, I like to write about fads and fashions and chess, baseball. There are chapters called Heaven and Earth, Citizen and State. Body and Soul, there's a lot of medical ethics in there. I spent a lot of time working on that, sort of a relic of my days as a physician and of my days on the President's Council on Bioethics. So, I mean, it's a smorgasbord, I think. I ended up in the compact disc version. I ended up reading part of the book, but when I got past all the funky stuff, I figured, I think I've had quite enough of my own writing. So the second half is left to a professional reader. But I really enjoy writing it. I hope that you will enjoy reading it. And I must say that when I think about the fact that it has done well, I think the best reason of all probably is quite this. People would like to read a book about politics that is not name-calling. I mean, I really don't believe in that. And those of you who've read my stuff will know that if you want to make an argument, it should be done civilly. And the way to win an argument, or the way to reach people, which is even more important than winning, is to have respect for their assumptions. I have great respect for American liberalism. I think its achievements are many, and that the country is well served by having had an FDR who gave us Social Security, and having had an LBJ who gave us Medicare. The argument I have with liberalism is that it is now stuck in a kind of reactionary phase where it lives off these great successes and is unwilling, unable to even imagine changing them, altering them, reforming them, improving them, when clearly they have to be or they will perish. I'll give you one example. Social Security was instituted in 1935. Life expectancy at the time was 62. Today, life expectancy is 80. Social Security was intended by FDR to prevent older people from living in destitution. That is a noble goal. But now that we have had this enormous increase in longevity, we should realize that it was never intended to subsidize the green fees of baby boomers for a third of their adult lives. That's not what it was intended to do. And if you try to make it do that, you will go broke. And that to me is sort of the essence. Medicare, for example, was instituted before the age of modern high-tech medicine. You combine that with the effects of longevity, and you have a program that is totally out of control, and that will not survive 5 more years. Everyone knows that. And to me, the burden and the agenda, in some ways, the mission of American conservatism is to take the best of these ideas, like Medicare, and to try to find ways to reform them and adapt them to the new age. My favorite example of how this thing works is Bismarck. He was the one who invented Social Security. And he pegged the age at which you first received your pensions from the government. This was 1889. At the age of 70. You know what life expectancy was? 47. The man wasn't a philanthropist. He was a genius. Got all the credit, didn't have to spend a penny. begin with the fact that each side should respect the other in the great debate that we're having, the one about the size, scope, and reach of government. And in some way, and this is where I want to end because I told you that I intended not to write about politics, but in the end there was no way to avoid it. Because in the end, for all its grasping, grubby, cynical manipulativeness, that's the day-to-day practice of politics. It is in the end the most important and most sovereign of all endeavors. Because, and this you heard in that lovely introduction, all the lovely, beautiful, elegant things in life, all art and science and poetry and music, all of that hinges and depends on a society getting its politics right. And you can have the most efflorescent, flourishing society, the most developed culture in the world. You get your politics wrong, and everything dissolves. Think of Germany, 1933. You don't have to go back in history. Look at this unbelievably precise, almost controlled chemical experiment. Korea. In the South, they got the politics right. Prosperous, free society where the individual can flow. North Korea, where they got the politics wrong. They live in a country totally enslaved, living in material and spiritual destitution. Same people, same history, same language, same culture. Only difference, one got the politics right, one got the politics wrong. And to me, that's why in the end I had to include the stuff about politics, because it is so. Even though we'd like to walk away from it, and there are many times that I want to walk away from it, except for that day when Cheney deployed the F word. The best day the Senate had all year. You want to walk away from it because it's a dirty, let's say it's, I wouldn't say dirty, it's hard to have clean hands, but in the end, it is sovereign, and in the end, it is the most important. And that, in the end, makes it the most noble. And I quote from John Adams in the introduction to the book. John Adams wrote that his generation had to work on war and politics so that the next generation could then develop itself in naval architecture and commerce, so that the third generation could devote itself to art and music, poetry, and porcelain of all things. And that kind of hierarchy was something that Adams understood, and something that sort of the American political system, American society understands. You've got to get the politics right, and we did. The miracle of America is that we got the politics right on day one. It is we talk about the biblical nature of the fall of the Soviet Union and how privileged we were, those of us old enough to live through that. Imagine how improbable, how providential it was that this small outpost of civilization across the ocean from Europe, this sort of semi-settled land, still semi-wilderness, should develop the greatest generation of political genius that man has ever seen, and would produce a constitution invented out of thin air, creating institutions and structures that had never even been imagined, that has endured longer than any other republic in the history of mankind. And we are the heirs of that. We have the unbelievable luck, the blessed luck of being heirs to that born in this land. And to me, that's what gives everyone the obligation never to walk away from that politics, no matter how soiled it feels and no matter how unclean one feels sometimes. You can't walk away from it because the Adams and the Jeffersons and the Washingtons managed to establish the structure, and it's the job of our generation and the next to tend it, because it will not tend itself. And that to me is the purpose of our politics, and that to me is the essence of our civilization. Bismarck also once said, he's my favorite pundit, he once said, and this is actually a quote, this one I did check, God looks after children, drunkards, idiots, and the United States of America. That's what the God is saying. Thank you very much. There's something providential about American history. It is so improbable. You know, we do get this generation who writes the Constitution. What are the odds of that? You know, a little outpost. In the next century, we need a Lincoln, and we get a Lincoln. In the next century, in the Depression and the win World War II, we get an FDR. He wasn't a conservative, but we needed him, and he carried us through. And in the second half of the 20th century, we needed a Reagan, and we got a Reagan. Now, I'm not going to hope for a Reagan in the future. You don't look for messiahs. But I wouldn't be so pessimistic. You know, I oppose everything Obama does, including his research. Including the color of his ties. This is unequivocal. But the country is resilient. I'm glad that we're having this debate. I do think he initiated this great debate. It's rare to have that. It comes once in a generation. This is the kind of debate we had in the early 1980s, the direction of the country. We sort of redirected ourselves in the 80s. And I think that kind of challenge to the country is important. Yes, I think some of the stuff you said, Obamacare and others, are going to harm us in some ways, particularly in medicine. I practice. I speak to my own colleagues. It's doing a lot of damage. But I do believe in America. And I do believe that we will overcome. And we will find our way. So I'm not that pessimistic. And I don't like to be apocalyptic. I think we will be very resilient. I used to give talks in the worst days where I'd be very pessimistic. And by the end of my talk, there'd be sobbing in the background. Handkerchiefs pulled out, tears rolling. And I would just end my talk by offering my services as a psychiatrist. To write prescriptions for antidepressants for anybody who needed them to get better. So I no longer do that. I just try to do it rhetorically. Yes, gentlemen in the 5th and 6th.
Considering what Vladimir Putin is doing in the Crimea, how likely do you think it is that we'll see the reconstitution of the Soviet Empire or some form of...
Did you all hear that? No. Considering what Putin is doing now in Ukraine, what's the likelihood that we will see a reconstitution of the Soviet Empire? We won't see a reconstitution of the Soviet Empire. Russia is too weak, economically, fundamentally weak. It has an extraction economy, and the only thing it exports is oil, gas, and vodka. And you can't sustain a modern economy on that. They don't make anything anybody wants. I haven't heard anybody say, have you seen the latest Russian iPhone? And geopolitically, they're hemmed in by people who don't like them. Not that it's undeserved, because as Henry Kissinger once observed, Since Peter the Great, Russia has expanded at the rate of a Belgium a year for 300 years. Although why any country would want that much chocolate, I don't know. They do push on their neighbors, and people don't like that. So they really, if you look at them geographically, we have the greatest luck in the world. Bismarck once said that the United States is so blessed, it's bordered by two weak and friendly neighbors on two sides and fish on the other. The man should have been a colonist. Russia's got China, hungry China, overpopulated China. Imagine what he's doing to Crimea. China one day is going to look to Siberia, which is being more and more populated by Chinese. And Russians don't want to live in the cold northeast. And I can see in 50 years they're going to do to the northern, eastern parts of Russia what Russia is doing to Crimea today. So yes, he's going to hold Crimea. He ain't giving it back. And we are not giving it back. Ukraine isn't either. He will threaten, weaken, and truncate Ukraine permanently. He scared the hell out of the Baltic states and the Poles and others who have a frontier with Ukraine, which is why we should tomorrow be sending the chairman of Joint Chiefs to arrange for joint exercises, defensive exercises, not aggressive, but defensive, to reassure the Baltic states and the Poles, the four countries that have a frontier with Ukraine, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, and Romania. So we should be doing all of that. But in the end, he will fail. He will succeed in the short run. And but he's not going to get, I don't think he's stupid enough to try to swallow all of Ukraine. He won't be able to hold it indefinitely. It'll end up being something he can't contain. But Crimea is quite a victory for him. Catherine got the word the Great after her, in part for her conquests. I think she conquered Crimea in 1783. And he wants to be remembered as Vlad the Great who got it back. So he will. But in the end, they're not going to be able to reconstitute anywhere near with it.
Large icons in the party today. Marco Rubio, Chris Christie, those people. Who do you think would give the Republican Party the best chance to break into President Obama's constituencies in the next presidential election?
Did you all hear that? Who's got the best shot to represent conservatism to win the next election? Marco Rubio, perhaps. Get that right. And well, let me just say right here, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that if nominated, I will not run. But if elected, I will serve. I'm just lazy. I want to eat chocolate-covered corn dogs at the Iowa State Fair. Bad for my stomach. Look, I think that one of the reasons I'm optimistic is because I think we have a very strong field in 2016. And I think we had a very weak field in 2012. Romney was the best, the only plausible candidate of that very weak field in 2012. And I think the opposite is true this time around. So the generation of young leaders who were just not ready in 2012. I don't think there was any meaning to the fact that they weren't all there. They were just sort of young and not prepared to do it. Rubio, I think, is very impressive. He had a bad year. There was a lot of internal debate over immigration, and that hurt him a lot, but I think he's a very dynamic, strong candidate. You've got others in the Senate. I don't think, by the way, Paul Ryan will run this time around. I think he will run in the future, but his ambitions, correctly, I think, are to be chairman of the Budget Committee and to be the man who reforms the great institutions of liberalism, Medicare, Social Security. I think he sees that as his mission, and I expect he'll spend a decade doing that. And then he'll be, at that point, he'll be 21 or 22. Have you ever seen a guy who looks younger? It's amazing. I don't know what he's like, Dick Clark. I don't know where that came from. So I see him running, much later in his career. A lot of great governors. You start with your governor here, Scott Walker. You've got the former governor of Florida, Jeb Bush. I think he'd be a terrific candidate. He has only one problem. You're always getting ahead of me. Yes, it's his last name. I have a solution. Change it. How about this? Jeb Ochocinco. The genius of that is that there are two constituencies at once. Hispanics and wide receivers. And you've got Susanna Martinez, and you've got, of course, Christie of New Jersey. I was upset with him also about the Hurricane Sandy stuff. I remember saying on the air, and this I did say on the air. He should be in quarantine for 90 days. People said that he gave Obama a bear hug. It's not quite right. What he did for Obama was a lap dance. Because the image is simply too disturbing. But the 90 days are over. But I have to say that I'm really disappointed with the bridge scandal. I mean, really. Talk about American decline. In the days when men were men and wise guys walked the streets of Camden, New Jersey, if you wanted to send the mayor of Fort Lee a message, he'd find a horse's head in his bed. He'd find a dead fish in the mail. And when he'd answer a knock on the door, it would be Tanya Harding. Closing 2 lanes on a bridge? Is that what revenge has come to?
Stand up. You're 19.
So we have a strong